Okay, and let me just check that it's coming out. Oh, yeah. Yep, that's all running.
Good.
So we've got about 8 people on at the moment. So just give a couple more minutes because it's never good to start right at the time, especially when I messed up on what time it is in Europe. You know how it is. It's just like Europe. You know,
it's a
where I
confusing
am,
week. Yeah.
Oh, I know, and it happens every time. It's like because most of the devices at home, I think it's only the coffee maker are automatic. You know, it just if you wake up in the morning and it's like, oh, it's a lot lighter. What's going on? And then you realize, oh, the clocks have changed.
Yeah, I will go through that next week. But I had several meetings with the US now, and everyone is confused. It's like, is it this week or next week, or where are we?
Yeah. When do we get back in sync again?
We solved a lot of technical problems, but not the time zone problem. That's still something we have to bring up and fix.
Exactly. Oh yeah, we can see lots of people coming on now, so that's good.
Yeah, I mean they have the Teams meeting up to the hour, and then they have to have a bio break and then come in.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
I see Dean being connected. All well with you, Dean?
Yeah, not bad. I've only got a short amount of time today, unfortunately. It's I've got lots going on here, but interested to get the flavour of what's happening.
Thank you. We'll see where it takes us.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is start the intro. So welcome, everyone, and I think everyone is in the Northern Hemisphere who's on at the moment, so happy spring. I think most of us are now starting to see signs that winter is finally drawing to a close. So what we've got is the first day of 3 days that we're running TAD Summit Special. So these are really presentations that we couldn't fit into TAD Summit back in November, or presentations that popped up that we thought, this is important. We need to get the message out there. So I'm really happy to introduce Olle and Sandro, who are going to be presenting on the EU Cyber Resilience Act and what it means for IP communications. Now, there's a lot of material to cover here. So what I ask is, as Olle's going through and Sandro's going through, if you have any questions, just raise your hand or add them into the chat, okay? And Olle and Sandro will take those questions. All right? So with that, Olle, Sandro, over to you.
Thank you. Then it's easier if I share my screen, I guess. I hope the screen is sharing okay. So, hi everyone and welcome. I'm Olle Johansson. I've been engaged in real-time communication for longer than I care to remember. I used to be an Asterisk developer and community guy, an evangelist, and God knows what. After that, I spent a lot of time with Kamailio, webrtc, and other applications, building real-time platforms for carriers, for broadband service providers, for alarm companies, the National Public Radio, and many others. So recently, I've been involved in a lot of security surrounding IoT, because IoT has a lot of properties that are similar to IP telephony. We have lots of devices, we have lots of data we need to ship around. So that's me. Who are you, Sandro?
Hi, I'm Sandro Gauci on a terrible connection right now, so apologies for that. And yeah, I lead the my company, Enable Security, and yeah, I've been in security since since the year 2000 officially, and even before that. And as Enable Security, what we do is we essentially bring offensive security testing for real-time communications, voice over IP, webrtc, that sort of thing. And we test the security of those things.
So, Sandro, do you remember our first interaction?
I'm not sure. I've seen your code before our first interaction for sure, but
no, I sent out a tweet once that, dear attackers, if you want to attack my code, please follow the RFC, because they sent a register. I sent a message back, and the code sent an ACK. And then Sandro immediately replied on Twitter saying, "Dear hacker, if you want to attack Olle, please upgrade to the latest version because I fixed that bug."
there's plenty more to be fixed, but yeah, that bug was very bad because it was flooding a lot of servers on the internet, actually.
Well, your code has flooded a lot of servers on the internet, regardless of bugs or not, but I still like
Indeed.
it. So, I spent a lot of time, like Sandro, in the world of real-time communication, and I've been doing a lot of evangelization. I've been talking at a lot of conferences, and for a long time, I've been talking about SIP and TLS and saying you need to protect your phone calls. You need to have TLS for confidentiality in the SIP signaling, and you need to use SRTP for protecting your audio. As kind of a thank you or a satiric response, I got this picture from the Soiper team. And I kind of like it. It's easy. Just use TLS, secure your calls. But that was the state like 10, 15 years ago. And since then, the landscape has changed quite a lot. And we're going to talk first a bit about what the European Union is up to, and then come back to the world of real-time communication and see how this affects our software, our vendors, our equipment, our platforms, and our phone calls, right? Or conference calls like we have right now. So the problem here is that we have had a lot of attacks that have caused serious problems. And it has cost a lot of money. Here in Sweden, we had one of the largest grocery stores, Coop, that had to close all the stores across the country for multiple days because of a ransomware attack. And the costs are high and the resilience is very low. It's very hard with current sets of software to actually survive an attack. And what the EU is saying is the same as the White House said a few days ago in their cybersecurity strategy document, that the balance between the users and the vendors is bad from a cybersecurity perspective, that more liability needs to be shifted towards the actual vendor who knows their product and can fix the problem. The vendors may say, yeah, but no user requires this. And that's what I heard from SIP telephone vendors for a long, long time. Yeah, they don't require it, but they just assume that phone calls are secure, as we assume that the apps we run, the equipment we buy is secure. So we've seen basically, apart from ransomware and denial of service attack, in the software world, we've seen multiple problems in the way we use dependencies. There are a lot of research done here, and there was a report, I think 2 weeks ago, that said that in almost all vertical sectors, when looking at software, about 80 to 90% of the software is made out of open source. We use libraries, we use existing tools to build our solutions to lower the cost and get to market more quickly. I think you all heard about Log4j, and we heard about all the issues in OpenSSL. Well, most of those are critical bugs. Developers like me wrote bad code that someone discovered and actually used to create problems. But with SolarWinds, there was another problem. Someone got control of the SolarWinds build tools, build chain, injected malicious code. SolarWinds built a release, distributed to customers, and now the attackers could actually attack the customers of SolarWinds. That was the first well-known example of a supply chain attack. And this is a problem we also need to look at, and we need routines to handle them. And we need ways to look at all the dependencies we have in the software we buy and the software we build as manufacturers. For Log4j, I mean, many of us that work as contractors or manufacturers, we had to spend several days trying to answer all the nervous questions. And all our customers have to spend 24/7, day and night, to find out, do we have this problem? Where do we have this problem? And how can we fix it? How can we block the problem from being used? So the cost of just finding out if they were actually affected by this incident was extremely high for individual companies, individual organizations, but also when you summarize from on a state level or a country level, the cost for Log4j was really high just to find out whether or not we were harmed by this problem. So the authorities react. We see this all over the world, that there are new strategies coming that will shift the balance towards more responsibility for the vendors. And the European Union does this with something they call the Cyber Resilience Act. It's a proposal right now, but it seems like it's going to come into effect this summer. And after that, we have 1 year as a manufacturer to get our vulnerability handling in order, and 2 years it will be a starting point from where we can only sell and distribute products that are secure by design. We'll come back to those definitions. So what is cybersecurity? I think possibly Sandro can explain this a bit better than me, but the words, you have to be careful with the word cyber. It's attached to almost anything that relates to the internet nowadays, or networking or computers. It's cyber technology. But the Swedish Association of Engineering, Ingenjörsvetenskapsakademin in our royal language, have defined 4 layers of security. And on the outside, we have security, which is physical security, personal security. But in the middle, Vikas, can you please mute yourself? Thank you. In the middle, we have cybersecurity, which is protection from external attacks. So we need to look at this regulation from that point of view. So the EU is actually delivering a few very clear messages when you read the text. Manufacturers need to take security seriously throughout the product's life cycle, and they need to be more transparent on cybersecurity aspects towards customers. And that's a really important piece of the puzzle. Many vendors have no tradition, don't know how to communicate with customers, whereas some do it very well. I mean, I'm not surprised when I get mail from Red Hat or Cisco or Microsoft or Apple on security issues. They explain what it is, they explain how to mitigate them and how to update my devices or software to get rid of them. But many vendors and open source project doesn't have this tradition. And the EU is also very clearly saying that the transition period of 24 months that they give the industry is enough and provides a clear direction. Now is the time to focus on cybersecurity and put everything else on back burner. Fix your problems, fix your code, deliver secure and safe products. Nothing else is more important. So which software does this apply on? Well, there are several regulations in the EU for cybersecurity in various vertical niches like aviation, military, medicine, and so on. There's also a new regulation called NIS2 that is targeting software as a service. So the Cyber Resilience Act focusing on everything from mobile apps, software you install on your PCs, and software in embedded systems, from consumers to business use. The software as a service exception is interesting because there is a clause saying if you have software in the cloud, software as a service, that has a direct connection to local components, like you're selling something and you have device management in the back, or you have solar cells with a statistic systems in the back, then the Cyber Resilience Act will apply to that part as well. So what does this mean for us then? Well, everything from mobile applications for video conferencing, telephony, or so, to embedded systems like the SIP soft phones I have plenty of here on my desk. I would say that unified communication as a service is excluded, but if you also sell hard phones and you have a direct connection to provision hard phones and manage the hard phones, then you're included in this. And of course, everything, PBX in a box, ISDN to SIP gateways, session border controllers, video apps, chat, all of that is included. So who's responsible here? Well, if you're a manufacturer within the EU, it's your responsibility. If you import products from anywhere and you label them with your own logotype and brand, then you're responsible. If you import products from outside the EU and place them on the market, or if you're a distributor, then you're responsible. So everyone that sell products on the EU market will be included here. And that is very interesting. We've been asking questions about, for instance, the Play stores and app stores. If you, through the App Store, buy something from outside the EU, will Apple and Google be responsible? Seems like that way. This also puts software distribution in scope as well, like GitHub, PewDiePie, Maven, similar repositories. It's unclear what the role of those will be in this case. The EU outlines two phases. I briefly mentioned this before, but in phase one, a manufacturer or anyone else that places products on the market have to be able to handle vulnerabilities. You have to report to ENISA, the European Cybersecurity Authority, any exploits in your products within 24 hours. And you need to have a program for managing and handling vulnerabilities and informing customers about all vulnerabilities in your code and third-party code that you depend upon. And this applies 12 months after regulations. So I would estimate mid-next summer. And this applies to all existing products and new products. In phase two, you get a longer list to work on in addition to the vulnerability handling. You need to prioritize cybersecurity and build secure products and deliver them with zero vulnerabilities and a secure configuration by default. You need to make sure your supply chain is secure and verifiable, because if something happens, the EU or the local authorities will run an audit on how you produce your software, check your logs, check your permissions, authorizations, and everything. The end result will be a CE label. Yes, this is the same old CE label as we've seen for all electronic products, but this will also apply to software. For most of the products, this will be self-certification. So you take responsibility yourself for applying the CE label and confirming that you are compatible with the regulation. For a small amount of products defined in the CRA, that is routers, operating system, firewalls, security components, TPMs, and so, there will be a need for a third-party certification. And it's still a bit unclear how that will happen, which authorities in each country that will have the right to certify, and the full procedure. I would assume that there are going to be long waiting lines to get approval. So within your organization, if you're in one of these roles, you really need to start working now. And if you haven't done it already, you're already late. So get your priorities right. Because if you're failing, the fines will be up to 15 million euros or 2.5% of the worldwide revenues in your company. So they're putting a large hockey stick up here and say, hey, go fix this. And this means this will be a management issue. Management will come down to research and development to verify where you are and where in the process you are. So the product's development organization, R&D, will need to change 180 degrees and skip all the new fancy cool features to be shown on the trade show next year and focus on security and vulnerability handling. And the marketing and communication departments also needs to figure out what changes in the relationship with your customers when you have to expose all your problems and they're not used to it. What happens if you're the first one in your niche on the market that does this? And what happens if you have to reveal for old products that you still have in distribution that there are 450 critical vulnerabilities in all the dependencies in your source code, and 5 of them are exploitable? So the question here is, will you have the same development budget, or will you get additional money to actually fix this and create new bugs in new features? I don't know. But it's going to be an interesting time in a lot of companies ahead of us. So the focus of the CRA is first to manage and fix vulnerabilities. Secondly, security by design. And third, to actually have a great deal of transparency for your customers. These are the 3 main bullets. And for transparency to customers, there's a lot of documentation needed and a lot of processes needed to inform them about your vulnerabilities and the mitigations for them. You also have to create a risk assessment that has to be reasonable. You can't limit your IP phone and say, well, I only assume this is going to be used on Sundays between 12 and noon by an old lady in a church. That's not a proper, I would say, base for a risk assessment. So the text in the proposed legislation is very clear that you can't limit unreasonable the usage of the product when you write your risk assessment. You also have to provide proper documentation in your product. You have to provide insights into how to report vulnerabilities and how to get access to the output of that process. All of this will be bundled with the existing EU declaration of conformance that you have for electronic products, but you haven't got it for software products, so that's going to be a new one. There's no requirement to provide your customers with a digital list of the contents in your product, a software bill of materials. I'm going to talk a bit more about software bill of materials and VEX in a while, but the VEX is I would say, a structured list of the existing vulnerabilities in all the components you have in your product, because many of them probably won't affect your product and won't affect your customer. With VEX, you can actually automatically say, I've gone through all this, I'm aware of it, but we don't execute that code in our product. And the customer will have to make a decision whether or not to trust that statement. But we'll be coming back to that. So the declaration of conformance is the base for your self-assessment. And you have to update that for every release. You have to update your risk assessment. You have to update your documentation. And that's kind of important. In the appendix, there are very detailed requirements. I won't go through all this text, but you can see a bit for yourself, and we're going to come back to this when Sandro takes over in a while. And it's kind of interesting because in most legal frameworks, most legal text, you try to avoid kind of expressions and stuff that is time dependent, because laws need to actually exist much longer than technology shifts that happens. But a lot of this is very unspecified and is kind of words that are popular right now and definitions like secure by design, or other things. But as I said, we come back to that. But there are three main points here, bullet points. One is secure by design. And two is delivered without any known vulnerabilities. And three, a high level of cybersecurity, whatever that is. That will probably shift from time to time. I mean, we see attacks now that we weren't aware of 5 years ago. So a high level of cybersecurity today is not the same as a high level of cybersecurity 5 or 10 years ago. But the same goes for crypto. The crypto we considered secure and unbreakable 10 years ago is something you can solve with a $10 Raspberry Pi Pico now and breaking through. So things change and regulation.
What you mean by crypto, Ole, is not cryptocurrencies and stuff like that, but cryptography,
no,
right?
Sorry.
In the old-fashioned way.
I'm old, Sandro.
It's the correct definition.
Crypto as algorithms and protection, confidentiality and authentication.
Good.
But thank you for clarifying that. I'm not talking about cryptocurrencies. So, considering all this new coming, your product development team really need to shift focus. They need to try to understand if they're selling to you, EU or existing EU, what the new regulation means for them. They need to, for themselves, make software dependencies visible. And they need to have processes to find vulnerabilities fast and fix them fast. And in the end, create more secure products, which is what the EU wants. So one part here for the manufacturing company is to look at their software supply chain. And it's vital that you have an automation here and you have logs and you can go back from the point of someone writing and committing code or adding a third-party library to testing, building, and distributing a released package. And the regulation also talks about security from design of a product to decommission of a product, security for the product's lifetime, and that needs to be managed as well. So, did we have any questions in the chat?
I think Alan was asking about continuous delivery, how it will be impacted, where releases are blurred.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. But that applies, I would say, mostly to cloud services where you have that. But if we have a device management system for devices, that may apply to devices as well, and your release versions will not be as clear as they think it is in the law. And that's one problem in writing laws. When they talk about releases, what is it? If I have a device with a Linux and I upgrade 50 components of the Linux, but not really my code, is that a new release or what is it?
Yeah.
So,
and I think the key word you said there is automation in terms of the process.
Yep. Automation will be needed. Otherwise, it'll be very hard to earn money here.
Exactly.
I think you have instances where this applies. This CI/CD pipelines are used to push new software in an SaaS cloud environment, which my understanding is might not apply in this case. But there are other cases where, like if you're using, for example, Element or Slack, right? The client, and this is updated kind of automatically, right? Yeah. So I wonder how that works there. That's a good question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there are many apps out there that is just the app in the App Store is just a framework.
Yeah,
and the app downloads something JavaScript that it runs internally in an embedded browser. And in that case, you can talk about continuous delivery. You keep upgrading, but the user doesn't see any upgrades.
Yeah.
But I think that there has to be a best current practice coming out here, and the CRA will have to find ways to handle that.
Understood. We have a question from Justin as well on, do you believe this will change vetting processes for third-party products?
Absolutely. And I will come to that in a short while. And I have some dreams there as well as an open source developer. That the whole idea of being open source developer will get me filthy rich, but I guess that won't happen. But we'll see. Can dream on. So, as I said earlier, almost all products today have a lot of components, a lot of third-party components. There are estimates that takes us from 80% to 95% being open source in a product. So you have in your cool IoT box you deliver, you have your own code, you created a couple of very cool protocols that do magic stuff, and you have your own hardware. But in addition to that, you have a lot of third-party things. And you have to realize that you have code that you use to build your product and release your product, but you also have a lot of code in the process of building. When you run your tool chain here and you run tests and you build, you use compilers, you use test tools, all of those also have to be verified. So there's a lot of focus on a new sort of data files called the software bill of materials, or SBOMs. Because of the pressure from US governments, from the White House and the EU and the UK and many parts of Asia, there's been a lot of activity in the standard bodies, everything from ITF to OWASP, and the Linux Foundation is all people are working on trying to automate, trying to find standard formats for this. But SBOM has existed for a while, mainly in vertical niches, the car industry, the medical industry, and a few others. So it's a digitally signed file listing all components of your product, their licenses and their origin, where you got it from. For instance, if you have a package called Curl, that actually does exist and celebrated its birthday yesterday, then you can get it from the Curl developers as source code and build yourself. But in many cases, you take it from your Linux system or your Windows system, then someone else built it for you, configured it for you, and you need to figure out what happened during that process. So you need to know the origin, not just the name of the actual component. The SBOM currently is used to track vulnerabilities. If you have the name and pointer to where you got the component from, you can run a check with a vulnerability database and see if you have any problems. So if you have a problem many layers deep down in your SBOM, in your genealogy tree, then your product will be affected somehow. At least you have to do some work to figure out what happens in your product with that code. But SBOM is not only used for this. I heard a talk with a guy from eBay that said that they take all the SBOMs for all the services in eBay and put them together and run statistics. And they list the top dependencies they have, all the open source projects and components. And then they run a health check on them. And he said that they quite frequently find out that they have a lot of dependencies on a small project where someone, after the kids have gone asleep, spend 1 hour or a couple of hours a week to maintain the project. And that project needs more resources, either monetary, so that that person actually can spend more time on the project, or more people. So that's one way of seeing SBOM. Can also be useful on the customer side. In the US, the authorities in public tenders will require SBOM as part of the delivery. And I think that will happen in Europe as well, that many large companies and governmental bodies will require an SBOM. This way they can build a database of all their software, everything they use. And if something like the Log4j problem happens again, the customers will be able to see very quickly if they're affected and where they're affected. If it's in a small part of the printers they have, well, they can turn them off while working on this. But if it's in mission critical systems, they have to take action with those vendors. But they don't have to spend several days phoning and mailing and trying to get answers from everyone, because they have the software bill of materials for all the products they depend upon. So I think that's an interesting usage and an interesting situation. But will also lead, if you haven't got detailed information about your usage in your SBOM, will lead to a lot of questions when you're actually having problems with dependencies. Regardless if you actually execute that code or not, the customer will see it as a hit and query you. Now, many of us work with open source or have a history in open source, and this is the first reason I actually got the CRA proposal under my eyes, because there is some very, very strange text in there. The first state very clearly that open source projects are good for society, and thus they're excluded from the Cyber Resilience Act. And that's all fine. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Made me happy. But then they add a text saying, this could be a way to get out of the responsibilities. So they add a text saying, if open source is part of a commercial relationship, a commercial activity, then the CRA applies. And a lot of people reading this have gone back to the EU saying, this is not okay, because open source developers, they're good people, but they still need money to buy food. So they sell support, they sell contractual development, they sell a lot of services. Will that mean that customers that download the software without having any relationship to them will make them responsible for the customer's use of their product? We still don't know. There's a lot of discussion about this. We had a podcast recording called Fossology, where Simon Phipps from the open source community took part, and he's been in Brussels a lot talking with the politicians here. And it seems like they believe they solved the problem with open source with this text. And we in the open source world believe they haven't. So we'll see what happens when the final text comes out. But I really hope that this text will change. And again, ignoring the Cyber Resilience Act will be very, very expensive. And I think for me, in the way I work as a contractor today, I'm very happy about this, because over many years, I opened a lot of issues that have ended up in the lowest part of the backlog with no priority, no comments whatsoever. And all of those have been security related, because the new feature, the new blinking lamp, the new thing is much more important than security. So I think adjusting the balance by regulation is a good thing. And it's interesting to see how they set the fine so high, so there will be very few excuses. So what happens now then? Well, if you're a manufacturer, distributor, or OEM of products that and will be affected, you have to look at all your products and define the gap. What will be the cost? What will be needed to make this product CRI compliant? And if you can't take that cost, if you don't have time to fix that product, you have to declare end of life of that product now. Because one other thing with the CRA is that the CRA give customers 5 years of free security updates on every product delivered on the market. 5 years of free security upgrades. And that's a lot of responsibility if you have a product that you don't want to bring in to this. I had a lot of discussions about this. And one thing people point out to me that is a huge risk for market disruption. We saw this a little bit when the GDPR arrived, that a few websites closed and said, well, I'm sorry, you're in the EU. I can't let you read this website or access the website because we're not GDPR compliant. I wonder if this will happen with products as well. But seeing the US cyber security strategy that came out a short while ago, I see that the same thing will likely happen in the US. So there will be very, very few markets for vendors who wants to create products without any thought of security in them. So we'll see what happens. Maybe for a short while, products will disappear and then come back in a new version. So to summarize this general overview of the CRA before we move into the world of real-time communication a bit more closely, the new regulation will likely be in place this year. We have, here in Sweden where I live, we are the chairs of the EU, and we have a group of people that are determined to make this happen. during the Swedish leadership. So in 1 year from that, manufacturers will have to get a vulnerability handling process in place. In 2 years after that, products will have to be secure by design, from creation to destruction. We have to secure our supply chains to make sure we don't get any malicious code or any other problems. We have to be able to go back and verify if problems arise with our products out in the customer base. And I think, as you asked before, Justin, that because of the process that applies to every dependency you add, there will be a cost per dependency, and that will make dependencies visible. And I hope this will change how manufacturers interact with open source, that they realize that it's cheaper to provide funding for the open source project to manage this properly than to actually have to fix it themselves. So we'll see if that happens, but that's kind of my dream, that the balance between open source and manufacturers will change. I can add a little bit of personal story here. During my years as a developer for Asterisk, I had several companies call me and say, first start with bragging about how many millions of dollars in revenue Asterisk provided them, and how happy they were that they had access to this open source system. And everything was fine. Then they came to the reason for them contacting me. And of course, there was a problem or a missing feature. And I started discussing the cost of helping them. And they said, well, no, we can't pay you because it's open source. Directly after, they bragged about how much they earned on my software, but they couldn't pay me a single dollar to help out. So I think the balance will have to change here as well. And I hope something like this will lead to that. But maybe that's just a good dream. So many manufacturers will also need a new way of communicating and handling security risk. The transparency is required by law, and this will change a lot of the relationships between customer and vendor. And open source will be affected, but is right now unclear how. And we're in a hurry. 2 years is a very short time if you have products that are far from secure and you have to fix them. Do you have any more questions? If you want to, you can turn on your mic and video and ask it, or add to the chat. Seems like there's a bit of information overload here.
No, it was excellent, Olle, and this was clear. I think there's a lot of questions around, from my perspective, the practical implementation of what CRA compliance really means. Because from as you've described, as has been stated, it's I mean, you said 80 to 95% of products have some kind of open source product, products in there. So it's a massive undertaking.
It is.
As you quite rightly pointed out, there's no new features next year. It's all security.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, there is a lot of pressure, and the open source community is responding. I canceled out from this time, but maybe we should run another seminar. I have a more technical presentation, but there's also something called the Open Source Security Foundation that belongs to the Linux Foundation. That is led by Brian Behlendorf, who once actually worked heavily in the Apache HTTPD project. They've done a lot of practical things and have a lot of interesting working groups. Everything from SigStore, which is a service that helps developers to sign their codes, their containers, their artifacts. They solved a lot of the issues with that by building open source software and a service. But they also have projects like Alpha Omega that got funds from Google, Microsoft, and Amazon to strengthen up open source project that needed. So they analyze open source projects, provide funding in the form of money and developers. So right now they're working heavily with Node.js, then they're working with Python, they're working with some Java projects. So there is a lot of change and new resources coming, but there's also working groups on education, on best practice for vulnerability handling for open source projects, and so on and so forth. But we can cover them in another session if it's interesting.
No, absolutely. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So do we have any more questions from the audience? Just giving, you know how it is. You have to ask multiple times. If
Absolutely.
not, should we move on to Sandro?
No, I have a few more slides, but
sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
No worries. I just took a short break here, but Sandro needs to be active here as well. So the detailed requirement.
Do I join in with my thing as the last part or now?
Let's, or maybe you can do it now and then we'll come back to my slides. Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we do that?
Okay, I'll do that. All right, let me share my screen. All right, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Is my screen clear?
It's kind of cut off on the sides, but otherwise clear.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Yep.
I'll zoom in and out. Okay, so what I did here was I took the this secure by design requirements, and this seems like, you know, in some ways it seems like someone from cybersecurity or InfoSec wrote it, because it seems like a wish list that we might send to some of our customers after some work. You should do this and this, and it seems to include a lot of these really useful things that we look for as security professionals. So I thought I would get all of these features and then map them onto stuff that we have seen in the real-time communications world. So voice over IP and webrtc, in this case, I'm focusing on that, and looking at different vulnerabilities that came out, and mapping that with each requirement. So I called it secure by design versus IP comms voice over IP webrtc. In this case, it could be more than that. So configuration that is secure by design, right? That's the first one. And here, if I open the link here, we can see, for example, this is some voice over IP solution, and yeah, it would come with a username and password, which is admin and admin. And this is something that, in voice over IP, when it comes to devices, when it comes to PBXs that are installed on hardware boxes, you would usually have this problem. Traditionally, this has been changing, of course, luckily, but you still have a lot of products that come with default passwords that are documented as they should be, but they shouldn't be there. You have to there should be a secure configuration by default, or a way to configure them securely by default. So this is just an example. And the second example, just to bring it to the webrtc world, is something that a friend of ours, Jörn, had noticed, that the Jitsi Meet on Docker, not Jitsi Meet the main project, but the Docker version, it used to come with default credentials, And essentially, we looked into this and we made a video showing how it could be abused, right? And essentially, you could log in to the Jabber server or XMPP server, which Jitsi uses, with these credentials, these default passwords, and this had administrative access, so you could do a lot of things once you're logged in with your user agent, with your XMPP client. And you might, for example, you could get just a menu in a tool like that, and you could just shut down the server like that with these credentials. Now, so that is configuration that is secure by design. You really do not want that, right? And there are various solutions. Of course, I'm not going to go into the solutions, just giving examples here, mapping one thing to the other, to real life scenarios that we have seen. Protection from unauthorized access. So here is another example. The Cisco Call Manager, the Cisco Unified Communications Manager, it had a security issue where you could enumerate users without any authentication needed. And yeah, they fixed that, of course, but this would fall under that. This is a good example. Another classic example is, well, SIP. Now, with SIP IP phones, whether hardware phones or software phones, it's by design sort of that whenever a phone gets a SIP invite message, it starts ringing. There is no authentication done there, but the assumption by the end user is that this device should only be getting calls from your SIP gateway or from your SIP provider, your phone provider. Well, it's not necessarily the case. And if you expose your phone on the internet, you will start noticing things like, now this is a very old article of ours, but yeah, people posting, pictures of SIP vicious calling them just because people, attackers are just scanning the internet and sending SIP invite messages to try to make phone calls for free. But in this case, they just get the phones to ring because it's by design. Now, what happens with something like this, where there is no, there is a dilemma, right? It's kind of by design, but the end users don't expect that. So we need to discuss this in much further detail. I don't think we have the time for that, but yeah, it's an interesting topic. It is, in my opinion, unauthorized access in many cases, but not always. Another example, and this is something that we found, free switch by default, until we reported it at least 2 years ago, they were not authenticating the message method and the subscribe method as well. This advisory is for the message method, and this allows old vulnerable installations of free switch to receive SIP messages, like similar to an SMS on your phone, without requiring any authentication. So, this is definitely unauthorized access there. And one last one, and I could keep going on, but I kind of stopped at this one. Coturn, and this is also something that we found, so we're bragging a little bit here. Coturn, originally, it had some access control protection, so that it does not. Coturn is part of the webrtc infrastructure, of course, and it's meant to connect different parties, and it does this by acting like a relay, like similar to a proxy in some ways. And so to prevent abuse of this, they have access control, and we found that you could bypass that default access control. So that is also an unauthorized access security issue, possibly. Next one, and please interrupt me if you have any questions about any of these things. Confidentiality for stored, transmitted, and processed data. The stored part, I found it quite interesting that they included that. But something that Olle, I think, has a lot to say about is that SIP is typically done over UDP. But with the
It's
Cyber
easy, you
Resilience
know.
Act,
Just use TLS. Slide 1.
just use TLS.
Yeah.
That's you 10 years ago, or probably more. So with this,
girls when
what
they
we're
were up
saying,
there, I
say
don't know
again?
how we got into it, because she asked how they were. I'm like, well, Molly's eating bees and the other one's doing this, and she's like,